My name is Peter Rosset, and I'm a faculty member or professor at El Colegio de la Frontera Sur, Sur in Mexico. Also a visiting professor at Thammasat University here in Thailand, and I'm a staff member of La Via Campesina, Mexico. I think that we have a global problem of the expansion of monoculture, and I think the monoculture is linked to agribusiness. And one of the largest, but not the only causes is the livestock industrial complex. And by having livestock in confined operations where they have massive numbers of chicken or pigs or cows together, then you need vast areas to produce the feed for those animals, and those monocultures to produce animal feed of different kinds of grains, whether it be soybeans in South America or whether it be maize in Southeast Asia, then are one of the drivers of the expansion of monoculture, deforestation, and a lot of other related problems. Of course, those are not the only monocultures. There are also monocultures of all of the other food and fiber crops that we get from agribusiness, but I use the livestock feed as one of the fastest growing areas of monoculture and industrial agriculture. We have a nexus of problems right now that are related to the expansion of monoculture, particularly but not only for livestock feed. Amongst those problems are climate change, but we also have problems of massive displacement of peasant and indigenous peoples' populations from rural areas. We also have problems of the emergence of new diseases. We have a nexus of problems. The way that this works, for example, is that the expansion of monoculture to feed livestock drives the cutting of the forest, whether it's the cutting of the forest, for example, in the case of South America, by agribusiness itself, to expand agribusiness owned and planted and controlled monoculture, or whether it's inducing small holders into changing their cropping patterns from complex, diverse peasant agriculture into monoculture to sell to livestock feed companies, as is the case with the maize monoculture boom in Southeast Asia. One way or another, it's driving the expansion of monoculture, it's driving the cutting of forest. So amongst the major causes of greenhouse gas emissions are forest clearing, and so this monoculture is driving forest clearing. Also confined livestock, they have a lot of emissions coming from the manure accumulation. If you have livestock that are, for example, with small farmers that are spread out in dispersed areas that are feeding on natural pasture, then their manure gets incorporated into the soil, is fertilizer for the pasture, for the other plant species that grow there. But when the livestock are confined with thousands of animals in a small area, then you get the manure accumulating in one place, contaminating waterways and emitting lots of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this particular set of problems driving climate change are also driving new diseases. So many of the diseases that we've faced in epidemic or pandemic proportions, whether it's swine flu or avian flu or E. coli outbreaks or salmonella outbreaks, a lot of them are related to this livestock, this confined livestock production. One way is that the animals are getting sick because they're overcrowded, they're being fed with antibiotics, with hormones, they're passing diseases, new diseases are breeding, emerging from those livestock operations. But the other is the cutting of the forest, because as forest areas are cut, then wildlife, which lives in the forest, comes closer and closer into the remaining forest around human habitation, and there's much more chance of livestock, of wild animals, whether it's bats or other kinds of animals, coming into contact with the human population and diseases jumping over. So for example, if we look at COVID, all of the major scientific hypotheses on the COVID origin have to do with the livestock or livestock feed industry. Either one hypothesis, it's because of forest clearing, smaller and smaller forests and the wildlife in contact with people, or it's because so-called wild meat was sold in so-called wet markets, but in fact most of that wild meat now is fed on the same livestock feed that is produced by the same companies that are producing the livestock feed for chickens and for pigs and for cows. In other words, it's exactly the same that's driving this now monetized, commercialized, confined production of so-called wild meat. And the final hypothesis is that it was a laboratory escape. But the reason why we have the danger of laboratory escape, for example, of new viruses, is that the companies that are engaged in this massive confined livestock production, they know that there's a risk that governments will ban this kind of production because it automatically leads to new diseases. So they want to get ahead of the curve, so they fund vaccine research. And the kind of vaccine research, part of the kind that they fund is called gain of function. So that means that in the lab, scientists create super powerful viruses so that they can create super powerful vaccines. And they do this so they can say to governments, you don't need to ban confined production because we're ahead of the curve, we're already developing the vaccines. The problem is if one of those super viruses escapes from the laboratory, we can have a pandemic. So at this point in time, we don't know the origin of COVID, but we can be sure that it has something to do with the livestock and livestock feed complex, whether it's research funded by them, forest clearing caused by them, or animals fed by them.